and let me start the recording so that we could go back and review it if you so choose. I'm going to go ahead and start my video as well. You should be able to see me. And I think we should be good to go. Now, let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Joseph Holbrook. I've been a cloud architect for several years, and I've had the opportunity to work with both AWS and Google Cloud. Now, what I'd like to do is, because of time purposes, we really can't go around the room and do introductions because we only have an hour, but I did want to allow you, if you so choose, to be able to, looks like, hold on a sec, some kind of technical issue here. What is going on? I am getting a mute sign. Why is that doing that? Okay. All right. So hopefully that does not come up again. Okay. So it looks like the microphone is good. All right. With that said, feel free to put in the Q&A any questions you may have. It should be open as of right now. And it looks like we have about 18 people on the call. So let's go ahead and get started. What I'd like to do is go through a couple things first, logistics-wise. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll answer your questions on the break as well, or after, whatever is needed. We'll go ahead. If you have any questions, feel free to put it as well in the Q&A. Whatever you're more comfortable with, I'll leave it up to you. The slides will be made available, as well as the recording will be made available after the webinar. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So as introduced before, I'm Joe Holbrook, Cloud Architect. I've been basically working with AWS and Google Cloud, technical trainer, as well as a course author as well. I've been really involved in both Google Cloud and, oddly enough, blockchain technology for the last year as well. And one of the things that I focus on is certification. And basically, I like to help people get certified. Now, I've been fairly well known on YouTube. I've got tons of Google Cloud certification videos on YouTube as well. You can go dig them up if you so choose. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? We want to cover basically what is GCP. We're going to cover the exam itself and why it's important to be able to understand what's on the exam, where you're going to get tested, but also the case study questions. If you're going to fail this exam, it is going to be because you are not understanding the Google Cloud services and how they go into the test question, but also how to identify in the case study what they're asking in the question, because this is a very case study exam. There's 3 case studies as of November 9th is when they updated the exam. They had 4 case studies, but now there's 3. So this should make it a little easier. However, technically, it's still a very hard exam, and about 50% of the exam is going to be case study questions. And therefore, if you don't know your services, you don't understand the best practices with Google or the Google way of doing things, then you're going to have some challenges. But I'm also going to cover some other areas briefly because we only have an hour. Usually when I teach Google Cloud, it's a 3-day class or 8-hour class. So I'm going to do my best to give you as much information as possible in as short a time period as possible. With that said, Let me do a quick audio check and make sure that everyone can hear me. If there isn't any issues, I guess people will let me know. Okay. Let's see. Double check. Recording is on, and we are live. Just want to double check. Good. Okay. So let's go ahead and get into the content. And then before too, I'm going to compare. Usually I get a lot of questions is, how does AWS certs compare to Google Cloud? I'm going to touch on that, and I'm going to touch on the demand for Google Cloud professionals as well. One of the things I can tell you is that the demand for the cloud certification is going up. Now, I don't know where everyone is located. Feel free to share that if you want. That may enable me to customize some of the information if needed as well. Okay, now let's see here. Let me check Q&A. I don't see anything in there, so we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So let's talk about Google Cloud Platform. Now, Google is, one of those, what I would call a cloud platform that really doesn't get the credit it deserves. And I think a lot of that just has to do with very, very poor marketing, but also they're really the last to the game. And what I mean by that is Google really didn't get into marketing and didn't get into the customer relationships like they should have. But they're doing that now. They're making the right hires. They're making a lot of changes. They're adding tons of new services that are going to be really competitive with AWS. And I think a lot of that just comes down to the fact that they have AWS has an 8-year head start, literally. With the exception of App Engine, to be honest, App Engine is superior in a lot of ways to like Elastic Beanstalk. But again, I'm not here to talk about the pros and cons. I just sort of want to get you started. Now, Google has their own data centers, of course. They have their own fiber backbones. They also have submarine lines, point of presence, and CDN. Now, how is this any different than other cloud platforms? Excuse me one sec. Well, they own their own infrastructure, and they also own submarine lines. And this is a big deal because what this enables Google Cloud to do is if you go from Google Cloud in Iowa to Charleston or to Oregon, wherever you're going to, from one GCP data center to another, and I'll talk about clouds and regions as well, or regions and zones, I should say. Basically, it's important to realize that you're not traversing out of the internet, out of the cloud to the internet. You're going directly on the backbone. And this is a big differentiator from a performance perspective as well. Now, there's sub-minute billing, sustained use discounts. One of the things that I do find Google to have an advantage over is the fact that there's so many ways to save money, but also they're very proactive in letting you know how to save money. For example, you have in Compute Engine, the ability to combine all your VMs, even if they're under different projects, as long as they're in the same zone, you're going to get the discount for that, which is something that's done automatically. And then you have recommendation engine. It's going to go in when you're running Compute Engine. It does it automatically and will let you know if this virtual machine that you spun up or these 1,000 VMs that you spun up, it'll let you know that you're using more resources than you need and that you should scale it down to this recommended machine image. You pay for only what you need, and it's truly that flexible. Now, Kubernetes engine, another differentiator is that Google, and again, I think a lot of the differentiators, I'm going to be honest, it depends on what your requirements are. If you're a development shop, it's pretty hard not to find Google more useful than AWS or even Azure. But of course, a lot of it does depend on what you're trying to do. If you're using .NET, you might want to stick with Azure. But with that said, you could still run .NET on Google Cloud. You can set up your containers, whatever you want to do. You have a lot of flexibility. You also have the choice of utilizing managed or unmanaged services. For time purposes, we can't get into all the services, but I did want to make sure that you're aware that Google does have managed services such as, services such as App Engine, and then unmanaged services such as Compute Engine, and Cloud Functions would be a managed service as well. Now here's a map that details the regions and zones of Google Cloud. Now Google is constantly adding new zones and regions, and to be honest, from a numbers perspective, they're right on target with AWS. The main difference, though, is the number of services and how those services are deployed. Google still has, from a footprint perspective, Google is just as competitive or more competitive depending on, the region and the services you're using. So from a numbers perspective, there's no difference. However, the difference does come in, though, based on the number of services and flexibility, Google still has some work there to do. So, I would say maturity-wise, AWS is here, Google is about here. And again, I think a lot of that, though, comes down to what you need and when you need it. So let's talk about the exam. Now, the exam, the link for the exam, basically the table of contents for the exam and the objectives and everything is listed right here. So you can feel free to go to that, and I'll go over to the website here in a minute. But basically, the exam is going to be challenging. And what I mean by challenging is this. You need to know the Google services, but you need to know how Google looks at cloud infrastructure. With that said, you also need to know the way the case studies are structured. And I've got coming up some examples of case study questions. I'm going to walk you through 2 or 3 of them to help you identify, is this the right exam or not? Do you need more training, or do you feel maybe it's time to move on to the test? So with that said, let's go ahead, go to the link. Give me a second to go and share the next application. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and share my browser here. And that should be good. Okay. Now, again, this is pretty much what the description is. I'm not going to spend time reading it to you. I'll let you do that on your own. But I want to point out some areas that have changed since the previous version to the new version. This exam was just updated November 9th. And this, again, is a fairly new update, and there isn't a lot of information on it. So I want to make sure that you have the latest information before you take the exam. Okay. So you could see that, give me a second. I think I went to the wrong page. There it is. Yeah. So this is actually the page you want to go to first, and then you go over to the second page I was on. So before we get started, this is what a cloud architect is. this is what they're going to test you on. And, again, all of this, is going to come down to what service, how is that service available, how is that service secure and compliant, how do you implement the services. That's really what it comes down to. Now, some other areas that they don't talk about is development. This exam, in my opinion, is fairly development heavy. Google still has this thought that anyone using Google Cloud should be a developer. And again, whether it's the cloud engineer, the data engineer, or the cloud architect, you need to know some development. And it could be as little as 10% of the exam or 20% of the exam. And I'll cover as much as I can on that. But with that said, I did want to point out, if you go down here, the exam's 2 hours, $200. And what you want to do is go over here to the exam guide and case studies. Now, this is the updated objectives. And as you see, there's section 1, designing and planning, designing a solution. So you see design. And one of the things I've done is I've developed a lot of exams in the past for CompTIA and Brocade as well as Hitachi. And with that said, as a best practice, you usually want to use the Bloom factor, the Bloom standards. And those are typically keywords around the task, around like a JTA as it's called. And so what you want to look for is design, 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 create. This is a new one, envision, like fantasize. I don't know where they got that, but that's out of the standard. Again, Google looks at things a little different. So envision is sort of planning, I guess, is sort of the way I look at this. So think of envision as planning or preparing, whatever you want to look at it. And then configure. So you do need to be able to configure cloud services for this exam. Design again. And I won't, again, time purposes, I can't go through this in detail, but I'm just pointing out some things you need to look at. Now, if you go down here, advise. So once again, analyze. Now, develop. Okay, you need to use tools like Dirt, Simian Army. Okay, I'll be honest, most cloud architects I know have no clue what those are. So you need to know what those are. Basically, it's a way that you could do testing, resiliency testing. You could also perform, depending on what you're doing, basically availability or code tests. There's a lot of solutions out there, but the goal is for testing availability of an application. So for example, another one that's not listed is Chaos Monkey, if you've ever heard of that. That's a popular one to use. Advising. So what is advising? Well, basically, this is you designing as a pre-sales engineer. This would be you going to the customer site, listening to what the customer wants, and coming out there with the design after you discuss the requirements with the customer. You might whiteboard, whatever that is. SDK. You have to know how to use the SDK. You have to be able to deploy it. Expect a question or two on how to utilize BigQuery as well. And then we have ensure. Again, this is a little out of the standard for keywords in Bloom, but what they're trying to get at is how do you facilitate management of your cloud platform. Okay, now here is where you need to spend some time before you take the exam. The first is Mount Kirk Games, Dress for a Win, and Terram Earth. These are the 3 case studies you need to know before you take the exam. Now, when I say you need to know, you need to spend some time before you take the exam, get familiar with the case studies. This will save you some time taking the exam. If you have 50 questions and 25 or 20 to 25 will be case study, you're going to run into a time crunch. And if you only have 2 hours, you're going to be going back and forth to the case study, to the question, to the answers, to the case study, going back and forth, back and forth. And if you get yourself familiar with this ahead of time, you're going to save yourself some time. You don't need to memorize it. You just need to know the format and where to look quickly. I'm going to cover one quickly, and then we'll get into the remainder of the content. How are we doing on time? I've got 1:51. So we've got about 40 minutes. So we're on schedule. Okay, so here's how the case study's laid out. And each of these case studies are different, so that's why you need to look at them. You have a company overview, the solution concept. Now, the solution concept is where the company wants to go, and what you have to look at as an architect on where things need to be planned out to get to, right? That's the direction you have to go in. And then they're going to have typically business requirements and technical requirements. Now, generally, and I'll hold off on some of this because I have some slides that I sort of detail this pretty well. But basically, they're going to ask you to answer the technical or the business requirements. In other words, one question, and the way the case study questions are structured generally from what I've seen, I've taken the 3 versions that I know that have been out there in the last 3 years. And so what they typically do is the case studies are asked all at once. And so you'll get like 4 or 5 questions, possibly maybe 3. Again, it depends. You'll get 3 on Mount Kirk, and one will ask you about business requirements. The other will ask you about technical. And then perhaps another one will go into, for example, like down here, what the executive statement is asking for, and what would you do in Google Cloud to meet that requirement. And again, each of the case studies have different sections. They have more detail than others, and that's why you want to take a little time to get familiar with this. Okay, so I think I killed this enough. Take some time to make sure you know where to find these, that you understand the flow of each of these. You will get 2 of these at least on the exam, if not all 3. I saw 2. However, I've been told by a student last week that he took his and they had all 3 case studies on the exam. So I don't know, Google's very, what I would call, secretive or whatever, hush hush, whatever that symbol is, to keep it hush hush. They don't want to tell you too much information, but I will say you'll get at least 2, if not 3 of the case studies. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop sharing that. And let's see, where is my next presentation? There it is. Okay. And let me see there. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. And just want to double check. Looks like you should be able to see that okay. So good. Okay. Let me go to, oops. Let me go right there. That's where it was. Okay. Now, the description of Google Cloud is there. The Cloud Architect. The goals of the exam are there. I won't read them all to you. I did want to spend some time on the case study questions for you. The exam is 2 hours. The registration fee is $200. It's 50 questions. However, it's not exactly 50 questions. What I mean by that is Google, basically will throw in there typically 2 to 5 questions to, survey and see, how a question does, I guess, and you don't get tested on it. Excuse me. I don't know how the structure is. Other folks I've talked to have told me 3 different things, so I don't want to tell you something and it's not right. But again, you can expect around 50 questions with typically 2 or 3 added on there, usually for, I guess, research purposes or trying to figure out, if a question is too hard or too soft, whatever the thinking is. At the time of writing, the exam's available in English and Japanese. Now, usually they upgrade the languages to Spanish and Portuguese as well. That's usually done a little after. I know the previous Cloud Architect, I believe, was available in 5 languages from what I remember. So who knows where they'll go. Okay, so this is the meat of the exam. This is where you will pass or you will fail. There is no option here. It's 50+% of the exam. Now, the case studies, they're going to take up about 50% of the exam. It's important to realize that these questions that are going to ask you how to look at a problem, look at a scenario, and try to address whatever they're asking about. You, of course, need to know Google services. It's all about Google. It's not about AWS. It's not a general, view of the world. It's what Google thinks. So you have to know that. So for example, when you're looking at the case study questions, this is how they're tested. Usually it's going to be cost optimization. That means if the customer is doing this, how do they reduce their infrastructure costs? Would taking their infrastructure from on-site, let's say they're running SQL in their in-house data center, and if they took SQL and put it in Google Cloud, would that save them money or not? Okay, in real life, maybe not, but in the Google's world, of course it would. So you have to realize that. Now, the business use case. In other words, a use case for business is going to be around what? Would the solution provide the outcome that is required, right? Remember I showed you in the case study at the very end, the executive use case sort of typically follows that in a lot of cases. There's usually a quick question or two around data migration. It's either going to focus honestly on cloud storage or virtual machines. Now, if you take any of my boot camps, I make sure you know how to migrate VMs, and I make sure that you know how to migrate from AWS to Google Cloud, but also how you can migrate from on-prem to Google Cloud as well. They're going to test you on how to use the Google provided services to get to Google Cloud, right? That's what it's all about, data migration. What can you do to integrate into Google Cloud? Part of the integration is going to be the SDKs. APIs could also be tying in services. What services integrate with other services, for example. Metrics. Now, this is going to be your monitoring. Usually Stackdriver is going to be pretty well tested here. You will need to know how to go into Stackdriver and basically create an alert. Also, one of the things that they're going to test you on with metrics, and again, this is a fairly wide area, is Stackdriver as a whole. Stackdriver is not just monitoring, it's not just other areas such as, basically, integrating, into a monitoring service. It's more than that. Stackdriver has what? It has development tools built in. It has the ability to run an application in the stack and debug it. It has the ability to trace. It has a lot of features. And then security and compliance. These are very well tested areas as well. And in a nutshell, select the right service for the right use case. Okay. Now, case studies do have some aspects as well around site recovery. I would recommend you go to module 13 of the site recovery book. If you Google, go to Google, how convenient, and type in the Google SRE book. There's a free version of this. If you don't take a class, you'll want to read, I think it's chapters 13 and 15. They talk about deploying applications in a pipeline, site recovery as well. They talk about monitoring, quality control, so on and so on. Okay. The exam questions are going to ask you to read a case study and refer to what? The technical or the business requirements generally. Most of the case study questions are going to be around there. However, a couple of the questions, like I said, will ask you to go to the executive summary and review, the summary and then answer the question based on, what they're trying to get out of you, whatever that is. Generally, the questions that are referring to like the executive summary or to what the CEO wants, whatever, the case study is referring to, is going to usually ask you to specify like a best practice or specify a specific service, not so much a pipeline of services generally. Not always the case, but just an idea. All right, so this is the first case study question that I want to talk about. This is pretty much where you're going to see the exam, the exact format. This is, of course, not the exact case study question, but I try to make it as close as I could without Google getting upset. Okay. Now, and again, I have a pretty good memory, and that's why I like these testings, because I can remember a lot of stuff. Okay. What I want to point out is, as you see, they're going to ask you to refer to a case study for these questions. And like I said, they're going to ask you 4 or 5 questions. Can we hear this okay? I just want to make sure. Any questions? No questions? Is there a problem with questions? Usually I get at least a ton of questions. So everybody hear me. How are we doing? Okay. All right. Can someone just raise their hand? You can hear me? Okay, good. All right. Thank you. Awesome. Thanks. I just want to, okay. Thank you so much, Corey. Appreciate that. Yep. Just want to double check. Thanks, Venkata, Siri, and everyone else that applied. Okay. Yeah. And again, if you have questions, feel free to pipe in. I just wanted to make sure that the auto didn't drop or something, which, again, it is the cloud, right? The cloud, even though it works 99% of the time, there's always that 1% that it may go down when you don't need it, right? And this is another thing, too, you want to think about when you're designing your enterprise services is the availability of your cloud service. And there's definitely a lot of things to consider. Okay, how are we doing on time? I've got 2:04. So good. We have a good amount of time to cover. I have, I think, 3 questions I put in there around the case studies. And again, I want to focus on the case studies because this is usually the hardest part for people. This will make or break your exam without a doubt. Okay. I think I got a question. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at this. And for those that want to go to the case study directly, make sure you go to the case study for the correct version of the test. When I had last checked, they had the version for November 9th and before, and then they had the version November 9th and after. I'm hoping they removed the one before so that you don't review the wrong case study questions, because the case studies were updated. It has the name of the case study for both versions, but the case studies, at least 2 of them from what I saw, were actually updated to a degree. Not too much, but enough to make a difference in how you approach it. Okay. Now, the case study questions, like I had stated, are going to test on 1 or more aspects. One sec. And when I say aspects, it's going to be site recovery, availability, migration, right? Those areas. They want to make sure that you understand how to address the customer requirements, but also what Google Cloud service you should specify. Or what I typically have seen in a lot of the case study questions is not just one service. It's usually 2 to 3 services that you have to select in the right order. So you may understand what cloud storage is, and you could figure that out pretty quickly. But if they talk about machine learning, you might get confused. Or actually where people go wrong, and I did this the first time I took the exam 3 years ago, it's very easy to confuse some of the names. So Google has names that are very similar. Big table, big query, right? Cloud data store, Cloud SQL, Cloud Spanner. Some of the names can, in your mind, can get confusing. Like, do I use big table, big query? Do I use Cloud SQL or Cloud Spanner? Again, know the right use case. Okay, and there's no simple way to memorize those other than that Cloud SQL is for relational databases, but Cloud Spanner is again meant for distributed relational Cloud SQL database, and that would be MySQL, for example, Postgres. And again, the question is do you want it localized or do you want it more geographic? And when you get to BigQuery and Big Table, and again, you need to know the difference between those. One's a data warehouse, and one might be more a database that's meant for other purposes, right? Document store, for example. All right, now let's go ahead and look at this quickly here. I'm not going to read it all. What I'm going to do is just give you a second to glance at it. But I want to point out a couple of things before you approach, because one of the things they're going to be really good at is Google's going to try to be discrete. Now, discrete is sort of there, it's there, but it's not clearly there. And what I mean is Google, if you don't take a Google course, what you need to do is go read the Google documentation and understand the best practices. Like, for example, Google uses very specific best practices for availability, for deploying pipelines. Also, this, in IT security, we have the least privilege, right? Least privilege is what? In other words, you're granting access to the users based on only what they need to the specific service that they need. That's how Google looks at it. You don't want to give an auditor basically write access when the auditor only needs view access. And yes, Google has very specific best practices for compliance and auditors. And you'll want to read the Google Docs on that very clearly, because on the exam, there's at least two, and sometimes I confuse myself between the other exams. But in general, they like to talk about auditors. And when they talk about auditors, auditors should only have view access. They shouldn't have modify, root access, depending on what they're doing, right? Only need to have view or read access. That's the only thing they should have. Now, in this case study question, I want you to look where they have, for example, developers. Okay, like I said, this is a developer-focused exam. And when I say it's developer-focused, Google still thinks the world is developers. They don't think, enterprises or production in a lot of cases. They want to talk about development. And this is a historical behavior that Google has had. And they're still getting out of that. So I want you to not get scared by these questions when you view this, because the challenge with the exam is to think like a developer, and not everyone's a developer. Some people are really good cloud architects, but the last thing they want to do is deploy a Python, service if they don't need to. So know your CI pipelines. Know how to use Google Cloud Security, Cloud Services. And in this case, they're talking specifically around how to isolate your cloud services for production, for staging, and development and test, right? So if you read here, and I don't know if you could see the mouse well, but developers and testers, so dev and test, and I know it's not super clear, they're not telling you that right now, and then staging and production. Now, what can happen here is how you have to understand how you could use Google Cloud to basically go in and create basically a pipeline, but also how you deploy a project and what a project does. So you have to understand a project is essentially a way you could deploy services and resources, but also create a separate billing instance as well if you want, and create essentially a sandbox of resources. I like to call it a sandbox because people get that generally. And again, do you want to create a sandbox for every instance here or just for a few? So let's find out more before we go and answer the question. So it says, how do you isolate development environments from staging and production? Okay, they're asking you right here to isolate development from staging and production. If you go up, it says test. Some people might get confused by that. So let's move on. Okay. So if I could get my mouse right, there it is. Okay. Now the answers are going to be similar to this. They're going to have a task for you. Do you create a project for development and test and another for staging and production? Now, I want to go back to the question and address this is where people will fail. They jump to conclusion before they actually understand what the question's asking. You could see that they talk about dev and test, and they talk about staging and production, right? So in your head, you're thinking, oh, okay, maybe I need 4 projects, or maybe I need 2 or 3 or whatever. No, read what they're asking. They want you to isolate basically development. They're only asking about production, development. And then they're asking about staging and production. So you need a project to basically isolate development. And then you'll likely need a project for staging and production. That's what they're really asking. And I know it could be deployed a couple different ways, but again, I'm just a messenger showing you, what Google as a best practice is going to expect you to know. Okay. Let's see how we doing on time. I've got 15 minutes. Okay. But the correct answer that you'd want to really look at is you want one project for dev and another for staging and production. So basically you need 3 projects in this case. Now again, you could also, and here's a challenge too, is you can look at this and say, isolate development from staging and production. Now on the exam, it would be fair game that they could basically create, a question that says 1 for development and 1 for staging production. So 2 projects instead of 3. Again, this is the tricky part. You got to read it. Okay, that was fairly simple. But again, the trickiness is just trying to figure out what Google is asking. This question, again, is going to refer to Mount Kirk. They want you to design their test strategy. And how do you look at the test coverage different from their existing backends on other platforms? Now, you need to go back to the case study and look at what they're doing and what they have to do to basically design a new test strategy. Now, if you read the case study, Mount Kirk Games is a gaming company, very heavy in mobile, very heavy in managing themselves. But the correct answer here is that they should include direct testing on the Google Cloud Platform infrastructure. Now, if you go back, here is a key. Because again, if you look at this, you may want to apply after release in production. Again, a lot of this can be based on what you're reading. And if you go back here, you go look at the case study question, and then go back to the question itself, and then try to understand how you want to differ the testing. And if you read the case study, what they're talking about is this. You don't want to test from your on-prem to Google Cloud. You want to test inside Google Cloud. That's what they were really asking and wanting you to do. Any questions before I proceed on? Let me just make sure. Okay. Good. Okay. Now I highlighted a few, as you see, a few things here. And I did this on purpose. I probably should have did it for the other questions, but this is really important because I'm highlighting these because if you go into this exam and you don't know the difference between a CI pipeline and a CD pipeline, you just knocked out about 10% of the questions. This is development. You need to know this. I advise you to spend time. If you don't take the formal classes, don't take the exam until you know everything around this. And also, too, know the complementary Google services to create that CI pipeline. For example, when you're deploying containers, Kubernetes engine, right? But also, too, what is a cloud repository? What is Google Cloud Build? These are all complementary services. And Google's going to expect you to know from point A to point D, what are the 4 services that you have to specify in the correct order to get the result of what they're asking. I hope that is pretty clear because, again, I'm not a developer by trade. However, with Google Cloud, I had to get a lot better at it. Because, again, every test they have, they're going to nail you with development questions, even the cloud engineer exam. So you have to know the basics. You have to know DevOps, continuous integration, continuous deployment, development. Also, too, you need to know agile processes to a degree for some of the exams. But you mainly know how the GCP services tie in to deploying these types of solutions. Okay, so let's look at this one here. Mark Kirk wants to set up a CD pipeline, a continuous delivery pipeline. And what they want to do is they want to make sure that the architecture is going to support many services, small services. That sort of sounds like microservices, doesn't it? Little services, small services. Again, sort of what it sounds like. And they want to be able to update and roll back quickly. They want to go from here back to here. And again, they want to use services generally that support that. And you need to know what services in Google have the ability to deploy. For example, we all know what a GitHub is, but you want to know what's a GitHub comparable in Google, right? Now, services that are deployed services that are deployed redundantly across multiple regions in the US and Europe. So they want to deploy services in the US and Europe and want them to be redundant. Okay. One of the things you have to know too is understand that specific services in Google Cloud are regional, some are zonal, and some can be global. Not truly in that sense, but they could be distributed, like Cloud Spanner. However, App Engine is actually a regional service. So if you have to deploy App Engine in Europe and App Engine in the US, you need to realize that you have to deploy multiple instances of App Engine and then figure out from a programming perspective how you're going to integrate and create that, redundancy that you may want. And again, if you read the case study, for time purposes, we can't go too deep into it, but I did want to point out one thing, immutable. Now, that term immutable means what? That means when it's written to the data storage, it can't be modified or deleted. In other words, it stays there, almost like a blockchain. So in other words, when those deployment artifacts are written to a Google Cloud service, it stays there. You can't go and delete it. You can't modify it. It's immutable. That's what that means. So you have to know what are the Google Cloud services here that are going to meet this. Now, you need to go to the case study, though, and get more detail before you can answer this, of course, right? So let's look at the case study question. Again, for time purposes, I can't go into each, but I didn't want to go and explain why this would be the right answer as opposed to the others. So first of all, they want to do what? They want to create a CD pipeline. And there's specific tools in Google Cloud. And again, if you don't know anything about this, type in Google Cloud Platform, continuous delivery, and there's a whole page on CI and CD that goes into how the services tie in. But again, I don't have time to go into that too deep. And then the thing is, they want to make updates, but they want to be able to roll back. Okay, great. Then it says they want to redundantly deploy across regions. So let's go back here. Actually, no, I didn't put the case study in there. But if you go back to the case study, you'll see that, again, they want to deploy, I think it was mobile solutions, basically, in their game services in a manner that is well distributed, but also too can be deployed with the CD pipeline. Now it says front end services are exposed to the public internet. Okay, now here's the key too. Now Google Cloud basically supports a single front end IP. In other words, a dedicated IP could be used for high availability, and that's load balancing. Artifacts are immutable. Well, again, that's going to be one of the container services. And this is the best answer: container registry, container engine, and then the load balancer, HTTP load balancer. Now remember, the HTTP load balancer would be correct because it's a web application, mobile app. If it's using HTTP protocol, probably this is the best answer. Now, if they talked about regional load balancing or UDP, then maybe you need to look at the network load balancer. But with that said, you need to know load balancing for the exam as well. There's no question. Any questions on this one here? Anything I can answer before I move on to the next one? Okay, good. Well, these guys are getting this right away, or you already know this, I'm not sure. But again, I want to make sure we get this. All right. Now, I think we're right on schedule, and yes, we are. Let's go ahead and talk about GCP certifications and how they map out to AWS. Now, there is a brand new cert that I just put in here. It's called the Google Cloud Developer. It's in beta right now. If you want to get a good deal on an exam and spend double the time to save half the money, or actually less than half the money, the beta exam is actually a good deal. But the beta exams are good too because you're getting like 100 questions, and you're going to see a lot more questions than are going to be on the real exam, the production exam. So if you go to the Google Cloud website and go to the Cloud Developer webpage, the link for the developer beta is available, and it's available. When I looked on Criterion, you could schedule it up until December 28th or so. So there's plenty of time to take it if you so choose. But the Cloud Engineer is comparable to the System Ops. The Cloud Architect is comparable to the Solutions Architect Professional. Now, on a level of difficulty, the Google Cloud Architect is much more difficult, at least the version of the AWS Solutions Architect exam I took. But again, that might have changed because it's been about 2 years since I took in the AWS one. So, but I've been told by other folks as well that, yeah, the Google Cloud Architect is much harder. The data engineer exam is comparable to the DevOps engineer, but with the combination of the big data specialty as well. And then the developer would map over to the associate developer in AWS. So how do you pass the exam? Well, it goes without saying, you have to prepare. Now, one of the things I want to point out is there really isn't a lot of good courseware out there on this. I'm pretty well known on many platforms for Google Cloud. Chances are, if I haven't spoke about it, no one else has. But I will say Google does a good job at releasing, like when they have a Cloud Next event, at releasing content that goes into detail into individual services. But there isn't a lot of like exam-based training. There just isn't. So feel free to connect that way. But I do encourage you to take a class if you're going to take the exam, especially if you don't have hands-on practice. This is even though it's an architect exam, it's not an exam that doesn't have hands-on, detail in it as well. And that's sort of what catches people, I think, as well. Okay. Now, the future depends on what you do today. One of my favorite quotes by, Mr. Gandhi there. We all know who probably have heard of him, right? But basically, you have to prepare. If you don't prepare, you're going to have a really hard time to pass the exam. And this is not one of those exams where you go out and get a test dump either, because it's all case study questions. It's not like an AWS exam where it's memorizing a service and that's it. But again, I think AWS is catching up to that area as well. So it's a hard exam is what I'm getting at. Very difficult. Okay, here's what you want to focus on. You want to review the case study questions slowly. Now, you want to review the case studies before the exam, but review them when you take the exam and make sure you read them very, very carefully. Like I pointed out, they'll throw one thing in there or two things that will catch you off guard. And they'll specify auditors, but you have to know Google's best practices for IT security to make sure that you specify the least privilege, for example. No compute options in detail. Compute engine, app engine, Kube, and cloud functions. To be honest, it's mainly going to be app engine. Like, why do you want to choose app engine over Kubernetes? Or why do you want to use compute engine over app engine? And a lot of that depends on what you want to manage and what you don't want to manage. But also, do you need to deploy containers or how you want to deploy containers? No. Okay. Another area that you want to know is around billing. Now, Google does expect you to know there is a Google Cloud calculator that you want to look at before you take the exam as well. And know how App Engine is built, know how BigQuery is built. Expect a question or two on billing, but mainly around VMs. So for example, there's inferred billing, preemptive billing, and then discounts, and know how they're handled. So for example, in AWS, we have spot instances, but in Google, they're not called spot instances, but they're handled differently. They're not really an auction either. So we have inferred instances, right? And preemptive instances as well. So basically, preemptive is going to run for 24 hours, comparable to a spot instance. Inferred is a little different. That's where they're going to give you the discount automatically based on your company's organizational usage in a project. Kubernetes. You have to know Kubernetes and how you deploy that with CI, CD, and DevOps. Load balancing. Expect a couple questions on load balancing. Okay. You don't need to know the super details of SQL, but you do need to know that MySQL and PostgreSQL is supported on Cloud SQL. But you also need to know as well the supportability of what's called legacy versus non-legacy. See, if you don't know that, I encourage you to go into Cloud SQL and just make sure you understand how that flows. Storage. Okay, storage is going to be tested heavily. And I want to say, geez, I did an old presentation on the old exam. I haven't had time to update it for the new exam, but I want to say the new exam is probably going to be about 12% is going to be around storage. And that's going to be cloud storage, persistent storage, but also too BigQuery, data warehouses as well. So the data services are heavily tested. Cloud DNS is a managed service. Make sure you know that. Know the use cases with big data and machine learning as well. One of the things that they added to this exam was a lot more around machine learning. But also too, how to visualize data and basically deploy big data services. Know the best practices for design and process. This is where you want to know Google's approach to designing a cloud and deploying cloud services on Google. You want to study hard. Focus on case studies. It's 50% of the exam. Memorize your cloud services. There's practice questions that you could find on various websites. I encourage you to go look at them and learn more. And use the practice questions as a gauge for you to, be ready for the exam. If you do well in the practice questions, you're probably going to do okay in the exam. Now, review the outline on the Google Cloud site, okay? It goes without saying. If you find 3 or 4 areas that you don't know what they're talking about, like why do I want to use Chaos Monkey or why do I want to deploy a CI pipeline, you have to review it because this exam, you could fail this because of one question. And if you get the give me questions, then you have room to spare on the questions that might have multiple answers that are the same but are just different by one variable. And again, like I said, a lot of people do get confused between Bigtable, BigQuery, or Cloud SQL, Cloud Spanner. There's actually a really good, on the Google Cloud website, a really good decision flow chart that I would encourage you to look at before you take the exam as well. Do you need managed services or unmanaged services? So take a look at that as well. Now, I do have resources posted over the internet as well. So feel free to take a look at those. One of the things I did want to point out, the link for this is here. Google Cloud Architect was noted by CIO Magazine as one of the top certifications for 2018. So take a look at that if you so choose. Now, there's some follow-on courses that are taught by Webage. There's basically, again, you could put together a training plan. I'd recommend that you remember that it is a top 10 cert and that this is likely going to grow in demand because Google's number 3 and not number 1, and therefore gives you some room to grow as well. One of the things I think most of us can agree on is anyone doing cloud computing has AWS. Not a lot of people have Google Cloud. So if there's demand requests for anywhere near me, I get the call because no one in Florida knows Google Cloud. Now, that doesn't mean I take the job or the role because, again, I'll be very honest. Cloud architect roles, the salaries have been driven down by a lot of factors. And this could be the differentiator between you keeping your job or getting a new job that might pay a little bit more. So I encourage you to consider that as well. So the demand is growing. It's, again, a lot of that too, I want to be honest, I don't know the market in England. I don't know the market in India or Australia or Europe or Brazil, Mexico, but in the US, it's growing. But one of the challenges with the cloud roles is that your expectations of what you have to know is wider. Okay, and that's one of the things people need to get used to is you have to do more for less. It's just a factoid. Now, but you also have to do more for more people and more organizations generally, and you have to realize that it's just part of the world that is what we live in now. However, to pass the exam, you need to know more, and that's what I'm getting at. Google expanded the requirements quite significantly from the previous 2 cloud architect exams. So do not take that lightly. Make sure you go to the outline I showed you and know everything on there. Okay. Now there's 2 classes that are currently available if you do want to know more. There's a 1-day boot camp that's called a cram session, I guess. And then there's a 3-day boot camp that is more in detail with a lot of labs, for example. So if, in general, the way this would work is generally what happens is that companies will send their employees to the 3-day boot camp and the 1-day boot camp as well. Because the 1-day crash, you call it a prep session, I'm sorry, I call it a cram session. But basically, the boot camp is really meant to give you the hands-on help. And then the prep session or the cram session is meant to reinforce that so that you know what to study for the exam. With that said, I believe if you have questions, I'll make myself available. There will be a recording that will be, of course, emailed out, I believe, after usually within 24 hours. With that said, I'll hold up for questions. Is there anything I can answer around the exam? I do want to see folks pass the exam. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions as well. And let me bring up the chat just in case. All right, any questions? Okay. Going once, going twice. Looks like I have a Q&A. Yeah, so good question, Oliver. I can only speak on what I've seen in the US. There's salary surveys out there. To be very honest, and this is, again, your experience may be different, but I found the salaries to be going down for experienced people, not going up. But I have seen the number of cloud architect roles go up. It's just that what you have to do has gone up as well. There's a lot of companies hiring. It's just that you need to know development now. You have to develop Python. You have to be able to develop in PHP or Node.js. Now, the salary range in the US can be anywhere from $80K a year to 140 to 160. But to get that, you have to be in New York, DC, San Francisco, San Jose generally. If you're in flyover America, as it's called, or in the smaller cities on the coast, you might get 120 if you're lucky. Or the way to get around that is to take on a travel role. The presentation deck, I believe, will be mailed out to all the participants. Let's see, did I get another? I'm just looking at my questions here. Okay, so I think that was about it. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. Okay, let me go ahead and move that over. Yeah, so good question, Christian. There is, so Christian, so there are basically like so one of the things I've done is I've created basically a study guide. It's over 80 pages of practice questions, and also sort of like what I call at Brocade when I developed these for those exams at the time, I called them basically cram notes, or like if you're taking like what is it in college, that Cliff Notes. So this is what it was. But again, it's only available if you take the full courses, unfortunately. I am actually working on a book deal around a study guide with a major publisher. That probably won't be available until I want to say probably September, to be honest. And I also do have other courses available as well online and other outlets, but I'm here for Webage, not promoting that. So, but there's other outlets that may have stuff that can help you. But if you want to have more study material, you really are encouraged to take the course. But it's funny because I probably have given up opportunities to make some good side money on that study guide as well. But with that said, if there's no other questions, I'm going to call it over, and I'll let Webage go ahead and close out the call here if there's no other questions. Okay. All right, let's see. Okay, yes, thank you, everyone. I wish you luck on the exam if you do take it, but I do hope to see you in a Webage class here shortly. The schedule is on the Webage website, I believe. And I'm not sure when the next class is. It's probably going to be January, but I'll let you determine that as well. I don't know on the top of my head. But with that said, I do encourage you to contact Webage and get enrolled in a GCP course here shortly. Thank you again for joining. Over and out.